Hey guys. Tonight we're going to a conservatory. Not for the romance. Not for the aesthetic appreciation of Victorian horticulture or the beauty of ferns unfurling in humid glass houses. Tonight we're going to a conservatory in England in 1855 to watch someone whisper to a plant that cost more than a working man earns in 6 months. The whispering is not poetic. It is not metaphorical. It is a literal practice that serious Victorian fern collectors engaged in as part of their cultivation routine. Speaking to ferns. Quietly. In the morning hours when the servants are not present to observe. Using the voice that you use when you are alone with something valuable and fragile and that you are trying, through every available means, to keep alive. The fern you are whispering to is Asplenium bulbiferum, a rare New Zealand spleenwort that arrived 3 weeks ago after 18 months on a waiting list. The fern is beautiful. The fern is delicate. The fern is worth a sum of money that you have not mentioned to your husband because mentioning it would require explaining it, and the explanation would reveal that you are in the grip of something that contemporary observers are beginning to call pteridomania. Fern madness. Tonight we're talking about the Victorian obsession with ferns. About the prices people paid. About the networks they joined. About the colonial extraction that supplied the market. About the hours they spent in glass houses maintaining temperature and humidity for plants that came from places they would never visit. About the whispering. About the madness that was systematic enough to have rules and expensive enough to cause financial strain and widespread enough to be recognized as a cultural phenomenon. So before we begin, if this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely brings you peace. Drop your city and time in the comments. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the sound of someone whispering to a fern in a Victorian conservatory. Now, let the darkness settle. Let it be the humid darkness of a glass house where exotic plants grow in conditions that human labor maintains because the plants cannot survive British conditions without intervention. You are whispering to a fern. Let's find out why. You are whispering to a fern. Not loudly. Not in a way that the servants would hear if they passed the conservatory door, which they will not because you have made it clear that the conservatory during your morning cultivation hours is private and interruptions are not welcome except in emergencies. But whispering nonetheless, speaking to the plant in the quiet voice that experienced fernery keepers use when they are alone with specimens that require the specific attention that words, somehow, seem to provide. The words are not important. You are not reciting poetry or making speeches. You are talking to the fern the way you talk to yourself when you are working through a problem, a quiet, continuous murmur that is less about content and more about presence, about paying attention, about the act of attention itself becoming a form of care. Good morning. The temperature held steady overnight. 63 degrees. You are looking well. The new frond is uncurling nicely. I will water you this afternoon, not this morning, because the humidity is still high from yesterday's misting. This is the kind of thing you say. Observations about conditions. Plans for care. Assessments of the plant's health. Spoken quietly to a plant that cannot understand language and that may or may not benefit from the carbon dioxide your breath provides or from the attention that the speaking indicates. You have been whispering to ferns for 3 years, since you acquired your first rare specimen, and read in a cultivation manual that some growers recommended speaking to plants during care. The manual did not explain the mechanism. It simply noted that growers who spoke to their plants seemed to have better success rates, and that while the causation was unclear, the correlation was worth noting. You tried it. The fern you were speaking to did well. It thrived, in fact, better than the ferns you were not speaking to. You began speaking to all of them. The success rate across your collection improved, or seemed to improve, or at least did not worsen, which in fern cultivation is sometimes the best outcome you can achieve. The practice spread through your network of fellow collectors. Not universally, some dismiss it as superstition. But enough of the successful cultivators do it that it has become an accepted part of serious practice, something that people do not necessarily advertise but that they do not hide from each other, either. The historical grounding here is that pteridomania, fern madness, was a genuine cultural phenomenon in Victorian Britain, peaking in the 1850s through 1880s. The obsession was documented extensively in horticultural journals, in personal diaries and correspondence, in the satirical press that mocked it, and in the commercial infrastructure that served it. Specialist nurseries, cultivation manuals, societies for fern enthusiasts. A whole economy built around the desire to possess and cultivate rare ferns. The whispering appears in this documentation. Not prominently. It was not the kind of practice that people wrote about formally. But it appears in personal letters between collectors, in marginal notes in cultivation journals, in the occasional horticultural manual that mentions it as a technique some growers use. The practice was real enough to be documented and common enough to be recognized. The theoretical justification was carbon dioxide. Human breath contains carbon dioxide. Plants use carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. Speaking to plants while in close proximity provides carbon dioxide directly to the leaves. This is chemically accurate as far as it goes. Whether the small additional quantity of carbon dioxide from speaking makes a meaningful difference to the plant's growth is a different question that Victorian science was not equipped to answer definitively. The alternative explanation is that the whispering correlates with other attentive behaviors. People who speak to their plants are people who are paying close attention. They are noticing changes in frond color, in growth patterns, in the subtle signs that indicate whether a plant is thriving or declining. They are responding quickly to problems. They are adjusting care in response to observation. The speaking might be causally irrelevant and still correlate with success because the speaking indicates the attention level that successful cultivation requires. The fringe detail is that some Victorian fern enthusiasts kept speaking journals, notebooks where they recorded not just cultivation data but what they said to their plants and how the plants responded. These journals survive in a few archives and they are strange documents, reading like one-sided conversations between people and plants. The intimacy is striking. The relationship with plants that emerges from these journals is not instrumental, not purely about successful cultivation, but effective, emotional, the kind of relationship that people form with things they spend hours with daily. The debate about whether speaking to plants helps them grow has never been definitively resolved. Modern research suggests that sound vibrations might affect plant growth under some conditions, that increased carbon dioxide exposure can benefit plants, that the attention and care associated with speaking to plants probably matters more than the speaking itself. The Victorian fern enthusiasts did not have this research. They had observation and correlation and the willingness to try practices that might help even when the mechanism was unclear. You are whispering to a fern because experienced cultivators whisper to ferns and you want the experience that experienced cultivators have. You are whispering because the fern is valuable and you want to do everything possible to ensure its survival. You are whispering because the practice has become habitual and the habit has become comforting and the comfort is itself valuable regardless of whether the fern benefits. The fern does not respond to your whispering in any way that you can observe. The fronds continue their slow unfurling at the rate that fronds unfurl regardless of whether anyone is speaking to them. The color remains the specific shade of green that indicates good health. The plant grows or does not grow according to its own biology and the environmental conditions you maintain, not according to the words you speak. But you whisper anyway because serious cultivation requires doing everything that might help, and because the line between science and superstition is less clear in the conservatory than in the laboratory. The fern costs more than you have told your husband. Not because he would forbid the purchase. He has learned over the 7 years of your marriage that forbidding your botanical acquisitions produces conflict without preventing the acquisitions. But because the specific amount would require justification that you do not have in any form that makes rational economic sense, and because avoiding the conversation is simpler than having it. The fern cost £50. £50 is more than your household spends on coal in a year. £50 is more than the parlor furniture costs when you furnish the house. £50 is approximately 6 months of wages for a skilled worker, a year's wages for a domestic servant, enough money to represent serious economic consequence in household budget calculations that your husband tracks with the attention that a solicitor brings to financial management. You paid it anyway. The purchase was not impulsive. You had been on the waiting list for 18 months. The nursery in Cornwall that specializes in rare New Zealand ferns had written 6 months ago to say that a specimen was expected on the next shipment, and that your position on the waiting list meant you would have first option to purchase when it arrived. The price would be £50, reflecting the rarity, the difficulty of transport, and the demand from other collectors. You confirmed your interest. You arranged for the payment to be drawn from your personal account, the account funded by the small inheritance from your mother that is legally yours to spend without your husband's approval, though spending it on ferns rather than on household improvements or charitable works is a choice that you do not discuss with him because discussion would invite opinions that you do not want to hear. The fern arrived 3 weeks ago in a Wardian case, a sealed glass container that maintained humidity during the 6-month sea voyage from New Zealand to Cornwall, and then the shorter rail journey from Cornwall to London. The case arrived with instructions for unpacking, for acclimation, for the specific cultivation requirements that Asplenium bulbiferum needs in order to survive in British conditions. You unpacked it carefully, following the instructions precisely. The fern was healthy. The fronds were intact. The root system appeared robust. You transferred it to a prepared pot with the soil composition the instructions specified, a mixture of peat, sand, and leaf mold that drains well but retains some moisture, the balance that ferns require. You placed it in the conservatory in a location with bright indirect light, away from the heating pipes that could dry the air too much, position where you could monitor it closely. The fern has been in your collection for 3 weeks. It appears to be adapting well. The fronds maintain their color. There are no signs of stress. You check it 3 times daily. You have whispered to it every morning since it arrived. You have spent more time thinking about this plant's welfare in 3 weeks than you have spent thinking about most things in your life. And you are aware that this is not proportionate, but you do it anyway. The historical evidence for Victorian rare fern prices is preserved in nursery catalogues, auction records, and the correspondence of collectors. The prices were extraordinary by any reasonable standard. Common British ferns could be acquired for pennies. Moderately rare exotic species sold for shillings. The truly rare specimens, species from New Zealand, Australia, tropical regions, species that were difficult to transport and difficult to cultivate, sold for pounds, sometimes dozens of pounds, occasionally hundreds. The economic scale is difficult for modern people to comprehend without translation. £50 in 1855 is approximately £5,000 to £6,000 in modern purchasing power. You have paid the equivalent of several £1,000s for a plant. People in your social network have paid more. The current record price that you are aware of is £100 for a particularly rare Australian fern that sold at auction last year, creating a price that subsequent acquisitions are calibrated against. The prices were driven by scarcity and demand operating in the classic pattern of luxury markets. The ferns were genuinely scarce. Acquiring them required plant hunters working in remote locations, transport networks that spanned oceans, nurseries that had the expertise to maintain them. But the scarcity alone does not explain the prices. The demand explains the prices, and the demand was cultural and social as much as it was botanical. Fern collecting was a status marker. A well-maintained fernery signaled that you had the knowledge, the resources, the connections, and the dedication that serious horticulture required. The cost was part of the signal. An expensive fern announced that you could afford expensive ferns, which announced your economic position and your priorities. The botanical merit was real and the status signaling was real, and they reinforced each other. The fringe detail is the debt. Some Victorian fern collectors went into debt financing their collections. This appears in bankruptcy records from the period where conservatory plants and equipment are occasionally listed among seized assets. The amount suggests that the debt was substantial, conservatory construction, heating costs, and plant acquisitions adding up to sums that some households could not sustain. The economic irrationality was noted by contemporary observers who could not understand paying more for a plant than for furniture or livestock, or investments that would produce financial returns. But the irrationality is the point. The willingness to spend irrationally on plants demonstrates that you value something other than pure economic return, which is itself a form of status signaling that the economically secure can afford and the economically insecure cannot. The debate about whether pteridomania was genuine botanical interest or conspicuous consumption is one that Victorian observers engaged with, and that modern historians continue. The positions are not mutually exclusive. The botanical interest was genuine. The cultivation journals and the correspondence and the published works show serious engagement with botany, with plant physiology, with the challenges of growing exotic species in Britain. The conspicuous consumption was also genuine. The prices, the displays, the social networks all functioned to signal status through plant collecting. Both things were true. The botanical knowledge was real and the status competition was real, and they coexisted in the same conservatories, tended by the same people, who understood themselves as serious botanists and also as participants in social networks where possession of rare plants mattered. The fern is worth what you paid for it because other collectors agree it is worth that much, which is how markets work when scarcity is real and desire is cultivated. You do not mention the price to your husband. Some things are better left unsaid. The fern traveled 6 months inside a glass box on a ship that went around the Cape. Most of the humans who made the same journey died of disease. The fern arrived healthy. This inversion, the plant surviving conditions that killed people, is made possible by the Wardian case, an invention that revolutionized plant transport, and that made the Victorian fern trade economically viable. Without the Wardian case, your fern would have died somewhere in the Indian Ocean, and you would be whispering to nothing. The Wardian case is a sealed glass container, usually rectangular, constructed with a wooden frame and glass panels on all sides and on top. The base contains soil. The plants are planted in the soil before the voyage begins. The case is sealed. The seal maintains humidity. Rain cannot enter. Salt spray cannot enter. The interior air remains humid regardless of external conditions. The plants inside grow slowly, protected from the environment that surrounds them, maintaining the moisture and temperature balance they require. The invention is credited to Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, a London doctor and amateur botanist who discovered the principle accidentally in 1829. Ward was trying to observe a moth chrysalis, and placed it in a sealed glass jar with some soil. Ferns sprouted in the soil. Ward noticed that the ferns thrived inside the sealed jar in London air that was too polluted for ferns to survive in open growing conditions. The sealed environment maintained humidity and protected the plants from atmospheric contamination. Ward experimented with larger containers. He published his observations in 1842 in a book titled On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. The commercial applications were immediately apparent. If plants could survive in sealed glass cases in London, they could survive in sealed glass cases on ships. The Wardian case was adopted by nurseries, by botanical gardens, by the imperial networks that were moving plants around the world for economic and scientific purposes. By 1855, Wardian cases are standard equipment for long-distance plant transport. Ships carry dozens or hundreds of cases, each containing multiple plants, stacked on deck or secured below depending on the specific requirements of the cargo and the captain's assessment of risk. The cases are monitored during the voyage, checked for seal integrity, sometimes opened briefly for air exchange if the voyage is long and the conditions allow, protected from damage during storms. Your fern traveled in a Wardian case that contained 12 plants. 6 reached England alive. Half the cargo died during the voyage despite the protection that the case provided. This is considered an acceptable survival rate for a 6-month journey around the Cape. The nursery in Cornwall that received the shipment accepted the losses as part of the business model. The cost of the dead plants is built into the price of the survivors. The fern that cost you £50 cost the nursery approximately £10 to acquire from the plant hunter who collected it in New Zealand, plus transport costs, plus the cost of the share of the Wardian case, plus the mortality risk, plus the overhead of maintaining the nursery's operation. The markup is substantial, but it reflects the real costs and risks of operating in a market where scarcity is created by distance and difficulty, and where demand supports prices that make the operation viable. The historical documentation of Wardian case transport is extensive because the cases were used for commercial and imperial plant movements that were documented in shipping records, in botanical garden correspondence, in nursery account books. The most famous use of the Wardian case was the transport of tea plants from China to India in the 1840s-50s, an operation conducted by the East India Company to break the Chinese monopoly on tea production. Thousands of tea plants were successfully moved from China to plantations in Assam, fundamentally changing global tea production. The Wardian case enabled this and hundreds of other plant transfers that shaped global agriculture and horticulture. Rubber seeds from Brazil to Malaysia. Cinchona plants, source of quinine, from South America to India. Breadfruit from Polynesia to the Caribbean. And thousands of ornamental plants, ferns, orchids, palms, exotic species of all kinds, moved from their native ranges to European collections and botanical gardens. The fringe detail is the specialized crews. Some ships carrying valuable Wardian case cargo employed crew members whose specific responsibility was the cases. Not full-time botanists, ships could not afford specialists for this purpose. But crew members with some plant knowledge, often recruited from gardening backgrounds, who were responsible for monitoring the cases, cleaning glass panels of salt spray, adjusting ventilation if conditions allowed, and protecting the cases from damage during rough seas. The insurance records for Wardian case cargo show that some shipments were insured for more than the ship's other cargo combined. A ship carrying 500 pound worth of other goods might carry 2,000 pound worth of plants in Wardian cases, reflecting both the high value of rare specimens and the institutional importance of some shipments. Botanical gardens moving collections, imperial agencies moving economic plants, commercial nurseries moving inventory. The debate about the Wardian case centers on whether it should be understood as botanical technology enabling scientific knowledge and cultural exchange, or as colonial extraction technology allowing systematic removal of plants from colonized territories for European profit and pleasure. The positions are not mutually exclusive. The Wardian case enabled both scientific exchange and colonial extraction, often simultaneously, in the same shipments, overseen by the same institutions. The tea plants moving from China to India were being removed from China without permission and installed in British colonial territory to create a competing industry that would undermine Chinese economic power. This was understood at the time as theft and as economic warfare. The Wardian cases that accomplished it were also being used to transport ornamental ferns to British collectors who wanted beautiful plants, and who understood their collecting as scientific engagement rather than as participation in colonial networks. Both things were true. The technology was neutral. The uses were not. The glass box that brought your fern to England is the same technology that is moving tea plants from China to India and rubber seeds from Brazil to Malaysia. You think of it as botanical. The people whose plants are being taken think of it differently. The conservatory costs more than the ferns inside it. The ferns will eventually die. Some already have. The specimens you acquire will be cultivated for years or months or weeks depending on their hardiness, and your skill and the specific compatibility between their requirements and the conditions you can provide. But they will die because plants die and exotic plants in British conditions die faster than native plants in their own conditions. The conservatory will remain. The structure that houses your collection is permanent in ways that the collection is not. Brick foundation, iron framework, hundreds of panes of glass held in place by putty and patience. The construction took 6 months. The cost was £280, which is more than you spent on any other single element of your house's establishment, and which represents a capital investment that you justify to your husband as property improvement, and as provision for family recreation and botanical education. These justifications were not dishonest. The conservatory does improve the property's value. Houses with conservatories command higher prices and attract better quality tenants if you ever need to rent. The conservatory does provide recreation. Your children play in it when weather prevents outdoor play, and the humid warmth is pleasant in winter. The botanical education is real. You have learned more about plant physiology in the 3 years since the conservatory was completed than you learned in all your prior education. But the justifications were also not complete. The primary function of the conservatory is to house your fern collection and to signal to visitors that you are the kind of household that maintains tropical plants in England. These functions are social and personal rather than purely economic, and they justify the expense in ways that economic calculation alone would not support. The conservatory is a lean-to structure built against the south wall of your house, positioned to receive maximum sun exposure during short winter days. The dimensions are 18 feet long, 12 feet wide, 10 feet high at the peak of the sloped glass roof. The interior volume is approximately 2,160 cubic feet, which is the volume that needs to be heated to maintain the 60 to 70 degree Fahrenheit temperature range that tropical ferns require. The heating system is a coal-fired boiler in the basement with hot water pipes running along the conservatory's north wall and under the central walkway. The system was expensive to install and is expensive to operate. You spend approximately £4 per month on coal during winter months, more than you spend on coal for heating the main house, because the conservatory requires continuous heat, while the main house tolerates temperature fluctuations. The temperature must not fluctuate. This is the primary challenge of conservatory management. Tropical plants that evolved in environments with minimal temperature variation do not adapt well to British conditions where night temperatures drop dramatically and where seasonal variation can be extreme. The heating system must maintain steady temperature regardless of external conditions, which means continuous fuel consumption, which means continuous cost. You manage the system yourself with help from the housemaid who has learned to maintain the boiler and who checks it twice nightly during cold periods to ensure the fire does not go out. The night checks are necessary because a single night of inadequate heating can kill sensitive specimens. You have lost plants to heating failures. The losses were expensive and distressing, and they taught you that the infrastructure of obsession requires infrastructure maintenance that cannot be delegated without oversight. The ventilation is manual. The conservatory has vents in the roof that can be opened to release excess heat and to provide air circulation. The vents must be managed carefully. Too much ventilation drops humidity. Too little allows heat to build to levels that stress plants. You open vents in morning after the temperature has stabilized, close them in afternoon before evening cooling begins. The management requires judgment that develops through experience and through the specific attention that conservatory keeping cultivates. The humidity is maintained through daily misting and through the design of the space itself. The brick floor is absorbent and is kept damp. The plants are arranged on tiered benches that allow air circulation while maintaining collective humidity. Water features, a small fountain, decorative bowls, contribute moisture to the air. The combination produces atmospheric humidity in the 60 to 80% range that ferns require, and that is substantially higher than the 40 to 50% humidity typical of British domestic interiors. The historical record of Victorian conservatory construction is preserved in architectural plans, in builders' account books, in the catalogues of companies that specialized in conservatory manufacture and installation. The scale of the industry was substantial. Companies like W&D, Bailey in London, Messenger and Company, and dozens of regional builders offered conservatory designs ranging from simple lean-to structures to elaborate freestanding buildings with heating systems, fountains, and architectural details that cost hundreds of pounds. The catalogs show price ranges from £50 for basic small structures to £500 plus for large elaborate designs. Your conservatory at £280 is mid-range, substantial but not extravagant, large enough to house a serious collection but not large enough to be a statement of exceptional wealth. The price positions you socially. It announces that you have resources but not unlimited resources, that you take fern collecting seriously but within bounds that middle-class economics allow. The fringe detail is the servant labor. Conservatory maintenance requires daily work that you cannot do alone. The heating system needs attention. The watering needs to be done carefully with specific techniques that differ by species. The misting needs to be done at times when you are occupied with other household management or social obligations. The cleaning of glass panes needs to be done regularly to maintain light transmission. This work is done by your housemaid, who has been trained in conservatory care and who receives no additional wages for the additional work because the work is understood as part of her general household duties. The invisibility of this labor in your cultivation practice is typical of Victorian domestic arrangements where servants enabled leisure activities without being acknowledged in the activities accounting. The debate about conservatories as rational investments or as conspicuous consumption is one that Victorian critics engaged with. The practical arguments, property value, recreation, education, were real. The status signaling was also real. A conservatory visible from the street announced economic position before visitors entered the house. The announcement was valuable even if the practical justifications were also true. The conservatory announces to visitors before they enter your house that you are the kind of family that maintains tropical plants in England. This announcement is the point. The ferns are almost incidental. You write to Mrs. Henderson about soil composition. The letter is carefully composed, written on good paper in your clearest hand, addressing Mrs. Henderson with the formal courtesy that your social position relative to hers requires. She is wealthier, her collection is larger, her conservatory is in Kensington while yours is in Bloomsbury. But you are writing as one serious fern collector to another, and in the specific domain of botanical knowledge the social hierarchy is partly suspended. The subject is soil composition for adiantum species, maidenhair ferns, which are notoriously difficult to cultivate, and which Mrs. Henderson has grown successfully for 2 years while your own attempts have failed. You are asking for the specific mixture she uses, the watering schedule, the humidity management, the details that successful cultivation requires and that failures demonstrate you are missing. The request is genuine. You want to succeed with adiantum and Mrs. Henderson has knowledge that you lack. But the request is also strategic. By writing to Mrs. Henderson you are maintaining contact with a collector whose network position is valuable, demonstrating your own seriousness by asking technical questions that only serious collectors would ask, and creating an obligation that may allow future requests for information or for access to specimens that Mrs. Henderson acquires before they reach general market availability. You do not tell Mrs. Henderson about the Asplenium bulbiferum that you acquired 3 weeks ago. The omission is deliberate. Some information is shared freely within the collector network. Cultivation techniques, sources for supplies, warnings about unreliable nurseries, condolences when valuable specimens die. All of this circulates through correspondence and through the visits that collectors pay to each other's conservatories. But acquisition information is competitive. The fern you acquired was rare enough that other collectors would have wanted it. Telling Mrs. Henderson would invite questions about how you secured it, about whether she might have acquired it if she had known it was available, about your relative positions in the network of collectors and dealers that determines who receives early notification of available specimens. You will tell her eventually. The Asplenium bulbiferum will be visible when she visits your conservatory, which she will do sometime in the next few months as part of the normal circulation of visits that the network maintains. She will see it, and you will discuss it, and she will assess its quality, and you will describe its provenance and cultivation requirements with the technical precision that collectors use when discussing specimens. But you will tell her when she sees it, not before. The timing is part of the social management that the network requires. The letter you are writing is part of a correspondence network that includes 8 other serious collectors, 6 in London, 2 in the countryside within visiting distance. You write to different people about different topics depending on their expertise and your relationship. Mrs. Henderson for difficult species cultivation. Mr. Pemberton for acquisition sources and dealer reliability. Mrs. Shaw for general encouragement and for the social connection that overlaps with but extends beyond fern collecting. Miss Thompson for botanical accuracy and Latin nomenclature because she reads German botanical texts and has access to European research that has not yet been translated into English. The correspondence is continuous. You write several letters per week. You receive several letters per week. The exchange of information is the network's primary currency, supplemented by the exchange of specimens, cuttings, spores, small plants that collectors share with each other as gifts or as exchanges that create ongoing reciprocal obligations. The historical documentation of Victorian fern collector networks is preserved in personal correspondence collections held in various archives. The letters are remarkably consistent in their patterns. Technical information about cultivation, information about dealers and sources, descriptions of specimens and their progress, condolences over losses, congratulations on successes. The emotional tone is engaged and serious. The botanical knowledge displayed is often substantial, sometimes exceeding what was available in published sources because the network's collective experimentation was generating knowledge that formal botany had not yet codified. Women were prominent in these networks in ways that were unusual for Victorian science. Fern collecting was one of a limited number of scientific practices that Victorian culture accepted as appropriate for middle-class women. The reasons were partly that it was domestic. Conservatories were attached to homes. Cultivation was domestic labor. The practice did not require travel or public presence in ways that other scientific activities did. But the effect was that women participated actively and seriously in botanical networks, published in horticultural journals under their own names, and were recognized as experts by male collectors who acknowledged their knowledge. The fringe detail is the friendship books. Some fern collectors maintained albums where visiting collectors would sketch or press specimens from their collections, creating a visual record of the network and of the specimens that circulated through it. These albums survive in a few archives and they are beautiful objects: watercolor sketches of rare ferns, pressed fronds carefully mounted and labeled, annotations describing provenance and cultivation, signatures of the collectors who contributed. The albums functioned as social records and as subtle competition. The collector whose album contained sketches from the most distinguished collectors, or who had the rarest specimens to contribute to others' albums, demonstrated network position through the album's contents. The albums were shown to visitors. They were discussed in correspondence. They were part of the display apparatus that made collection meaningful through recognition. The debate about whether fern collector networks represented genuine scientific community or primarily social competition is one that the historical record supports from both directions. The cooperation was real, information was shared, techniques were discussed, knowledge accumulated through collective experimentation that advanced cultivation success rates. The competition was also real. Collectors compared collections, competed for rare specimens, managed information strategically to maintain advantages, evaluated each other's knowledge and taste with the judgment that any competitive network applies. Both things were true. The cooperation and the competition coexisted without contradiction because they served different functions that were both necessary for the network's operation. Mrs. Henderson tells you about her watering schedule. You tell her about your humidity management. Neither of you mentions your most recent acquisitions. The cooperation is real and the competition is real and they coexist without contradiction. The man who found your fern in a New Zealand rainforest was paid £5 for it. He sold it to a nursery for £10. The nursery sold it to you for £50. He is still in New Zealand, looking for more. His name was Thomas Wright, though you do not know this because the documentation that came with your fern does not name him. The documentation identifies the nursery in Cornwall that supplied the specimen and notes that it was collected in North Island, New Zealand, 1853, which is the level of provenance detail that the market provides. The individual who did the collecting is not part of the information that travels with the plant. Thomas Wright is 34 years old. He was a gardener in Surrey before taking employment with a commercial nursery that wanted someone willing to travel to New Zealand to collect fern specimens for the British market. The pay was £50 per year plus a percentage of the value of successfully delivered specimens, which represented more money than Wright could earn as a gardener, and which required leaving England for minimum 2 years with the understanding that disease or accident or violence could end the employment before the contract completed. Wright accepted the terms because the alternative was remaining a gardener earning £20 per year with no prospects for advancement. The risk calculation was straightforward. High risk of death. High potential return if survival succeeded. The calculation that working-class men with limited options make when someone offers them more money for more dangerous work. Wright has been in New Zealand for 18 months. He operates primarily in North Island rainforests, searching for fern species that are rare or absent in British collections and that British collectors will pay for. The work is physically demanding. The rainforest terrain is difficult: steep slopes, dense vegetation, rivers that flood without warning, weather that shifts from sun to heavy rain in minutes. The work is also dangerous. Wright travels alone or with one Maori guide when he can hire one, carrying equipment and supplies for weeks-long expeditions into regions where European settlement is sparse and where the environmental hazards include insects, weather exposure, and the risk of getting lost in terrain without maps or familiar landmarks. The ferns he collects must be kept alive during collection and during transport to the coast where ships depart for England. This requires carrying the plants carefully, maintaining them in conditions that rainforest ferns require, protecting them from damage and from drying out during the days or weeks between collection and delivery to the ship. The mortality rate is high. Wright collects dozens of specimens. Perhaps half survive to shipment. Perhaps half of those survive the 6-month sea voyage in Wardian cases. The fern that reaches you represents 10 or 20 collected plants of which it was the successful survivor. Wright is paid by the specimen. Each fern that reaches England alive and that the nursery assesses as worth selling generates payment to Wright based on the species' market value and rarity. Common species earn pennies. Moderately rare species earn shillings. Rare species that collectors want earn pounds. The Asplenium bulbifera that became your fern earned Wright £5, paid when the nursery in Cornwall confirmed successful delivery and assessed the specimen's quality. £5 is 3 months' wages for Wright at his previous gardening employment. One successful rare specimen equals 3 months of his previous work. But the 3 months of previous work did not include rainforest expeditions, disease exposure, injury risk, or the possibility of not returning at all. The calculation makes sense only when you are 34 with no wealth and limited prospects, and someone offers you a chance to earn in 2 years what would have taken 10 years in your previous employment. The historical documentation of Victorian plant hunters exists in fragmentary form: nursery correspondence, explorer accounts, occasional biographical sketches of successful hunters who became famous enough to merit documentation. Thomas Wright is a composite based on documented plant hunters who worked in similar circumstances during the same period. The Lobb brothers, William and Thomas, who collected for Veitch Nursery in Asia and South America. David Douglas, who collected in North America. Robert Fortune, who collected in China. And dozens of unnamed collectors who worked for commercial nurseries, whose names appear only in account books if they appear at all, whose deaths were recorded only when their employers noticed they had not returned. The mortality rate was substantial. Estimates suggest that 1/3 to 1/2 of Victorian plant hunters working in tropical or remote regions died during their employment. Disease was the primary killer: malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, infections from minor injuries that became serious without medical treatment. Accidents were common: falls, drowning, exposure. Violence occurred. Some plant hunters were killed by local populations who objected to their presence or their activities, though this was less common than disease or accident. The fringe detail is the indigenous knowledge. Plant hunters like Wright depended on local populations to locate specimens, to guide them through terrain they did not know, to provide food and shelter and protection. This dependence was rarely acknowledged in the documentation. The plant hunter was credited with the discovery. The guide who led him to the plant was not credited. The botanical knowledge that local populations had developed about which plants grew where and when was appropriated without attribution. Some plant hunters acknowledged this dependence in their private writings. Robert Fortune's journals describe relying on Chinese informants for plant locations. David Douglas's accounts mention indigenous guides. But the public narrative was the European plant hunter discovering plants in remote locations through his own skill and courage, with indigenous assistance erased or minimized. The debate about Victorian plant hunting centers on whether it should be understood as botanical exploration that expanded scientific knowledge or as colonial extraction that removed valuable biological resources from colonized territories without compensation. The positions are not mutually exclusive. The botanical knowledge generated was real. The specimens returned to Europe did advance European botanical science. The colonial extraction was also real. The plants were removed without permission from territories that Britain controlled or influenced, and the economic and scientific benefits accrued to Britain, while the source territories received nothing. Both things were true. The advancement of botany and the colonial theft operated simultaneously, in the same expeditions, using the same infrastructure. Your fern has a history that begins in a rainforest where someone climbed trees and dug in wet soil and packed living plants into boxes and carried them to a ship. You know this abstractly. The distance between abstract knowledge and actual consideration is the distance the fern traveled. You check the conservatory 3 times per day. Morning, after breakfast, before the household's daily activities fully begin. Afternoon, between 3 and 4, when light levels are optimal and when temperature from the midday sun has stabilized. Evening, before dinner, when you assess the day's changes and make decisions about overnight care. Each check takes 40 minutes. Longer if problems require attention. Shorter only if you are rushed and conduct the check incompletely, which you do when social obligations prevent full attention but which leaves you anxious about conditions you have not fully assessed. This is time you do not have. Your household management requires attention. Your children require attention. Your social obligations require attention. The correspondence you maintain and the calls you pay and the various activities that constitute your life as a middle-class Victorian woman all require time that your days do not always contain in sufficient quantity. You take the time anyway because the ferns require it, and because the alternative is cultivation failure that you have experienced, and that you are not willing to risk with valuable specimens. The morning check begins with temperature assessment. The thermometer in the conservatory should read between 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, slightly higher in summer. You record the temperature in your cultivation journal, a bound notebook where 3 years of daily temperature readings create a dataset that you consult when making cultivation decisions. The temperature patterns teach you about your heating system's performance, about seasonal variation, about the thermal properties of your conservatory's specific design. The thermometer reading leads to heating adjustment. If temperature is low, you send for the housemaid to add coal to the boiler. If temperature is high, you open roof vents to release excess heat. The adjustments are based on experience accumulated through trial and error, and through the specific relationship you have developed with your conservatory's particular thermal characteristics. After temperature, humidity. The hygrometer should read 60 to 80% depending on season and on the specific requirements of the specimens currently in cultivation. You assess humidity visually, condensation on glass, moisture on leaves, the feeling of air when you breathe it. You adjust through misting or through opening vents or through adjusting water features that contribute ambient humidity. The management is as much art as science, developed through hundreds of hours of observation and response. Then the plants themselves. You move through the conservatory systematically, examining each specimen for signs of stress, disease, pest infestation, or growth changes. The examination is visual and tactile. You touch leaves gently to assess their firmness. You look at frond edges for browning or curling. You check soil moisture by pressing a finger into the pot. You assess overall plant vigor through the subtle signs that experienced cultivators learn to read. You speak to the plants during this examination. Not continuously. Not to every plant. But to the valuable specimens, to the difficult species, to the new acquisitions that you are monitoring with particular attention. The speaking is quiet and observational. Descriptions of what you see, plans for care, assessments of health. The carbon dioxide theory suggests this helps. The attention theory suggests it correlates with care. You are not certain which theory is correct. You do it anyway. The afternoon check is shorter, primarily visual assessment, looking for changes since morning, monitoring light levels, making ventilation adjustments as afternoon temperature shifts. The evening check is longest, careful examination, watering decisions, planning for overnight conditions, adjustments to heating for the night period when temperatures drop and when maintaining steady conditions is most challenging. The cultivation journal documents all of this. Date, temperature, humidity, watering schedule, observations about individual specimens, problems noted, actions taken. 3 years of entries create a record that is partly scientific observation and partly obsessive documentation of time spent on practice that has become central to your daily life. The historical evidence for Victorian fern cultivation practices comes from published manuals, from personal journals that survive in archives, and from the correspondence between collectors. The manuals provide baseline information, temperature ranges, soil compositions, watering schedules standardized across species. The journals and correspondence reveal the personal adaptations, the specific techniques individual cultivators developed for their specific conservatories, the trial and error that generated knowledge beyond what manuals provided. Some of the journals are remarkable documents. Daily temperature and humidity readings recorded for years. Detailed observations about individual plants. Notes about successful and failed techniques. Drawings of front structures and growth patterns. The dedication these journals represent is the dedication that obsession produces when it is given systematic outlet through horticultural practice. The fringe detail is the night maintenance. During cold periods, conservatory heating requires continuous monitoring. Some households employed servants on night shifts to check boiler fires and maintain temperature. Your household cannot afford dedicated night staff, so you and the housemaid share the responsibility. You check temperature before sleep. The housemaid checks it during the night if weather is particularly cold. You check it on waking. A failed fire during a cold night can drop conservatory temperature low enough to kill sensitive tropical species. You have experienced this failure once. It killed 3 ferns worth a combined 25 pounds. You do not allow it to happen again. The debate about whether Victorian fern cultivation represented genuine horticultural science or obsessive-compulsive behavior is one that modern psychiatry would approach with diagnostic categories that Victorians did not have. The DSM-5 criteria for obsessive-compulsive disorder include recurrent, time-consuming compulsions that significantly interfere with daily functioning. The 3 times daily conservatory checks that consume 2 hours collectively would meet the time-consuming criterion. Whether they significantly interfere with daily functioning depends on how you define functioning and whether you consider fern cultivation to be part of normal functioning or a disruption of it. Victorian culture did not pathologize horticultural obsession. Serious plant collecting was recognized as appropriate middle-class recreation. The time investment was considered normal for a serious collector. The economic investment was questioned when it became excessive but was generally accepted within the bounds that your practice maintains. The obsessive quality was noted, even mocked in satirical publications, but was not treated as requiring medical intervention. The ferns require the attention you give them. They also require less attention than you give them. The excess is not for the ferns. The excess is for you, for the satisfaction that obsessive care provides regardless of whether the obsessive element is strictly necessary. The conservatory has visiting hours. Not posted. Not formal. But understood. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons 3 to 5, the conservatory is open to callers who have the social standing to call and the interest to appreciate what they are being shown. This is not advertised. The conservatory is visible from the street through the glass walls, which announces its existence to anyone passing. But the invitation to view is extended through social networks rather than through general availability. You invite people. Mrs. Henderson invites people who are her social equals or superiors. The network regulates access through the same mechanisms that regulate all middle-class social interaction, knowing who is appropriate, extending invitations strategically, using access as a form of social currency. The visits follow a pattern. The caller arrives during the designated hours. Tea is served in the drawing room. Conversation establishes or maintains social relationship. Then the invitation. Would you like to see the conservatory? Delivered with the specific tone that indicates this is the purpose of the call, not an afterthought. The conservatory tour is structured. You lead. The visitor follows. You move through the space systematically, stopping at specimens worth noting, providing commentary that demonstrates knowledge while displaying the collection. The commentary is technical and social simultaneously. Botanical information delivered in conversational tone, specimen provenance that indicates your network connections, cultivation challenges that demonstrate your expertise. This is Asplenium bulbiferum, from New Zealand. It arrived 6 weeks ago after 18 months on a waiting list. Extraordinarily difficult to maintain, the humidity must be constant and the temperature cannot fluctuate more than a few degrees or the fronds brown at the edges. I've had good success with it so far. The new growth here suggests it is adapting well to conservatory conditions. This commentary accomplishes multiple functions. It identifies the specimen for visitors who know enough botany to recognize the Latin names. It establishes the specimen's rarity through the waiting list reference. It demonstrates cultivation expertise through the technical discussion. It performs modesty through the understated, good success, that actually indicates significant achievement. And it invites the visitor to recognize your accomplishment by seeing the new growth and understanding what successful adaptation means. The visitor responds with appropriate admiration. How beautiful! The fronds are extraordinary. I have not seen this species before. You must be very pleased with its progress. This response fulfills social obligation while also indicating that the visitor recognizes rarity and understands enough about fern cultivation to appreciate the achievement. The exchange is social performance, but the performance is meaningful because the expertise being performed is real and because the recognition being offered is genuine appreciation from someone competent to appreciate. The tour continues. 43 specimens. Not all receive equal attention. The common British ferns are noted briefly. These are standard Dryopteris, quite hardy, require minimal care. The rare exotics receive detailed discussion. The Asplenium bulbiferum receives the most attention because it is the newest, the most expensive, the most impressive achievement currently in your collection. The tour takes 30 minutes. Tea follows in the drawing room. The conversation continues with botanical topics mixing with social news, with assessment of other collectors' recent acquisitions, with discussion of sources and dealers and the market generally. The visitor departs. You have displayed your collection. The visitor has seen it and recognized it and will discuss it with others in the network. Your position is maintained or enhanced depending on how your collection compared to what the visitor has seen elsewhere. The historical record of conservatory visiting practices is preserved in social correspondence, in diaries that document calls paid and received, in the etiquette manuals that described proper behavior for various social occasions including conservatory tours. The practice was widespread among fern collectors. The conservatory was semi-public space, private property but understood as appropriate for display to selected visitors. The display served multiple functions. It provided evidence of successful cultivation that could not be conveyed in correspondence alone. Seeing a thriving rare fern was more convincing than reading about it. It allowed comparative assessment. Visitors could evaluate your collection against others they had seen. It created opportunities for discussion that advanced collective knowledge, seeing each other's techniques, sharing observations, identifying problems and solutions through conversation that written correspondence could not fully replicate. The fringe detail is the labeled displays. Some ambitious collectors created elaborate labeling systems, small plaques beside each pot identifying the specimen by Latin name, geographic origin, date acquired, and sometimes cultivation notes. These labels served educational and status functions simultaneously. They demonstrated botanical knowledge through accurate nomenclature. They announced specimen provenance and acquisition dates that established collection history. They made the conservatory function as a private museum where knowledge was displayed alongside specimens. Your conservatory is labeled. You installed small ceramic labels 18 months ago after visiting Mrs. Henderson's conservatory and seeing her labeling system and recognizing that it elevated the display quality significantly. The labels cost £3 and required several weeks to install properly. They are now part of the conservatory's permanent infrastructure, providing information to visitors and organizing your own knowledge about specimens whose cultivation requirements you sometimes need to reference quickly. The debate about conservatory display centers on whether it represented genuine desire to share botanical knowledge and beauty, or whether it was purely status competition. The evidence supports both interpretations simultaneously. The botanical enthusiasm was genuine. The tours included substantive technical discussion, visitors and hosts exchanged cultivation knowledge, the engagement with plants was serious rather than superficial. The status competition was also genuine. The tours allowed comparative assessment. Collectors cared deeply about how their collections measured against others. The display was performed with awareness that recognition mattered. Both motives operated simultaneously. The knowledge sharing was real and the competition was real, and they were not in conflict because they served the same network through different mechanisms. Mrs. Henderson admires your Asplenium bulbiferum. You explain its provenance, its cultivation requirements, its botanical significance. The explanation is genuine and the performance is genuine, and they are the same thing. Knowledge displayed is knowledge doubled. The Asplenium bulbiferum that costs £50 and that you whisper to every morning for 6 months is dying. You have done everything right. You maintain temperature in the correct range. Daily recordings confirm 60 to 65 degrees with fluctuation never exceeding 3 degrees. You maintained humidity at 70 to 75% through careful misting and through keeping the conservatory floor damp and through managing ventilation to prevent excessive drying. You watered appropriately. The soil was kept evenly moist but not waterlogged, the drainage was adequate, the watering schedule matched the species requirements that the cultivation manual specified. You spoke to it every morning. You monitored it carefully. You responded immediately when the first signs of stress appeared 3 weeks ago, slight browning at frond edges, a subtle change in color from the vibrant green of health to a slightly duller shade that indicated something was wrong. You adjusted everything you could think to adjust. You increased humidity slightly. You moved the specimen to a location with slightly different light exposure. You examined the roots for signs of rot or infestation and found nothing. You wrote to Mrs. Henderson describing the symptoms and asking for advice. She responded with suggestions that you implemented immediately. Nothing helped. The browning spread from the frond edges inward. New growth that had been emerging stopped developing. The color continued to dull. You checked daily, sometimes multiple times daily, looking for improvement or for additional symptoms that might indicate what was wrong. You found no clear cause and no effective response. The fern is dying despite perfect care, which is the specific frustration that exotic fern cultivation sometimes produces. The specimen cannot thrive in British conditions regardless of how carefully those conditions are managed because the specimen evolved in conditions that British conservatory technology cannot fully replicate. The temperature is correct and the humidity is correct and the light is correct within the ranges that human observation and Victorian technology can measure and control. But something is wrong at a level that you cannot detect or cannot correct. You are watching 50 pounds die slowly over a period of weeks while you are unable to prevent it. The emotional response to this is difficult to articulate to people who do not maintain rare plant collections. Your husband, when you mentioned the fern's decline, responded with sympathy that was genuine but that also indicated he did not understand why this death mattered more than the deaths of the common ferns that have died in your conservatory over the years. It matters because of the cost. Because of the rarity. Because of the 18 months you waited for it. Because of the 6 months you have invested in its care. Because its successful cultivation was an achievement that elevated your collection and your status within the network, and its death represents the loss of that achievement. But it matters also because you formed a relationship with this plant through 6 months of daily attention and through the speaking and through the specific intimacy that develops when you care for something fragile and watch it respond or fail to respond to the care. The fern became more than a botanical specimen. It became the focus of sustained attention that creates emotional investment regardless of the object's nature. The historical documentation of fern cultivation failures is less extensive than the documentation of successes because failures were not subjects that collectors wanted to write about. But failures appear in correspondence as references to losses, in collection inventories as notations that specimens are no longer present, in the gaps between acquisition records and display records that indicate specimens were acquired but did not survive to be displayed. The mortality rates for exotic ferns in British collections were high. Estimates based on surviving records suggest that 30 to 50% of exotic fern acquisitions died within the first year of cultivation. Some species had higher failure rates. Tropical species that required conditions that British conservatories could not provide, species whose specific requirements were not understood, species that were too fragile to survive the stress of transport and adaptation to cultivation conditions. The high failure rate was economically sustainable only because the collectors who could afford rare ferns could afford losses. A 50-pound fern that died was a loss that middle-class collectors like you felt but could sustain. The working class could not participate in this market not only because they could not afford the initial purchase but because they could not afford the risk that the purchase would die and represent total loss. The fringe detail is the death records. Some collectors maintain detailed documentation of failures, descriptions of symptoms, suspected causes, post-mortem examinations of root systems and fronds, notes about what might have been done differently. These records were sometimes shared with other collectors as cautionary information. They were also private documents of grief and frustration that reflected the emotional investment that cultivation failures produced. One such record survives in the archives of a Victorian collector whose journal documents the death of a particularly rare Australian fern. The entry is several pages long. It describes symptoms in daily detail over 3 weeks. It analyzes possible causes. It concludes with a statement that reads, in part, "I cannot determine what I did wrong. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps some requirement I do not know exists and cannot provide. The specimen is dead regardless. I am left with the knowledge that expertise has limits, and that sometimes the limits are not apparent until they are exceeded." This captures the specific frustration. The expertise is real. The care is genuine. The failure happens anyway because the gap between what you can provide and what the plant requires is unbridgeable with the knowledge and technology available. The debate about whether high cultivation failure rates made Victorian fern collecting fundamentally irrational is one that economic analysis would answer clearly. Yes, paying £50 for a plant that has a 40% chance of dying within a year is not rational investment. But the rationality question assumes that the purchase was investment-seeking return rather than consumption-seeking experience, and consumption-seeking social position, and practice-seeking meaning through sustained engagement with difficult challenges. The collectors were not investing. They were consuming experiences and social positions that the money purchased along with the plants. The plant death was part of the cost, not a failure of the investment model, because investment was not the model being operated. The Asplenium bulbiferum dies on a Thursday. The fronds are entirely brown. The root system, when you examine it after removing the specimen from its pot, shows rot that you did not detect earlier because it was internal and progressed without external signs until it was too late to address. You remove the dead plant from the conservatory on Friday. The removal feels like a small funeral, carrying something that you cared for and that is now dead to the waste area where it will be burned. You do not burn it immediately. It sits for 2 days while you decide whether to preserve a frond as pressed specimen for your records or whether to dispose of it entirely and remove the reminder of failure. You preserve a frond. You press it between sheets of paper and weight it with books. You will mount it in your cultivation journal with a notation about the acquisition date, the cultivation period, and the death. This is documentation and this is memorial, and they are the same thing. The space the fern occupied is empty for 3 days before you begin considering what specimen might replace it. The replacement will cost more than the original. This is how obsession sustains itself through failure. Punch magazine calls it pteridamania. Fern madness. The article appears in the October 1855 issue and it is satirical in the way that Punch approaches everything, sharp, observant, mocking without being cruel, identifying the absurdity while acknowledging the phenomenon's reality. The article describes middle-class families spending more on ferns than on food, conservatories heated to tropical temperatures while bedrooms remain cold, women neglecting household management to tend plants, men competing for rare specimens with the intensity that others bring to business or politics. The article is funny. The satire is effective. The descriptions are exaggerated but not entirely inaccurate. You recognize yourself in the description of a woman who speaks to her ferns with greater tenderness than to her husband and with certainly more frequency. The exaggeration makes it funny. The accuracy makes it uncomfortable. You do not find it funny because it is describing you. The term Pteridomania, fern madness, was coined by Charles Kingsley in his 1855 book Glaucus, or The Wonders of the Shore, where he used it to describe the mania for fern collecting that had seized British society. The term was adopted enthusiastically by satirical publications and by critics of the practice. It was adopted somewhat defensively by participants who acknowledged the obsessive element, while maintaining that the obsession was justified by the botanical interest and the recreational value. By 1860, 5 years after the peak, the phenomenon is waning. Fashion is shifting toward orchids, which are even more expensive and even more difficult to cultivate, and which represent the next stage of the same collecting impulse, finding new objects. Fern prices are declining as cultivation techniques improve and as supply increases and as demand decreases. The 50 pounds Asplenium bulbifera that you purchased in 1855 sells for 20 pounds in 1860 and for 5 pounds in 1870, as rarities become less rare through improved collection and transport networks. The decline does not stop you from collecting. You still maintain your conservatory. You still acquire new specimens, though less frequently and at lower prices. You still check the conservatory 3 times daily and whisper to the valuable specimens. The practice has become habitual. The habit has become identity. You are someone who collects ferns, and this identity persists even as the cultural moment that produced it has passed. The historical resolution of Pteridomania is that it faded gradually through the 1860s-70s as fashion shifted and as the economic model that supported high prices collapsed under increased supply. The collectors who had built serious collections maintained them. The casual collectors who had participated because it was fashionable moved to other practices. The infrastructure remained: conservatories, cultivation knowledge, networks of collectors who continued corresponding and visiting. The botanical knowledge generated by Pteridomania was substantial and permanent. The collective experimentation by thousands of collectors refined cultivation techniques for hundreds of species. The knowledge was codified in cultivation manuals that remained useful long after the mania faded. The specimen collections in private conservatories and in botanical gardens preserved genetic diversity and enabled subsequent botanical research. The obsession produced genuine scientific value alongside the social competition and the economic irrationality. The fringe detail is the self-awareness. Victorian fern collectors writing in the 1860s and 1870s, after the peak had passed, often acknowledged the obsessive nature of their earlier practice while also defending it. Letters and memoirs contain passages like, "I recognize that I spent more on ferns than prudence would justify, but I do not regret it, for the pleasure was real and the knowledge gained was genuine." This combination of acknowledgement and defense is typical of participants in cultural phenomena looking back after the cultural moment has passed. The debate about whether Pteridomania was harmless recreational obsession or symptom of deeper Victorian anxieties is one that cultural historians engage with. The positions are not mutually exclusive. The obsession provided genuine pleasure, genuine recreation, genuine social connection, and genuine botanical knowledge to participants. It also expressed Victorian anxieties about industrialization that was transforming the natural landscape, about colonial expansion that was bringing exotic plants from distant territories, about class and status in a society where middle-class identity was being constructed through consumption and display. Both things were true. The pleasure was real and the anxiety was real, and they were expressed through the same practices in the same conservatories by the same people. You are whispering to a fern. You have been whispering to ferns for 7 years. You have spent more money on ferns than on furniture. Your conservatory contains specimens from 5 continents. You can name each one in Latin and describe its cultivation requirements, and explain why it matters that you possess it rather than someone else possessing it. This is madness. This is also your life. The distinction is less important than the commitment. The Punch article sits on your desk for 3 days before you finally dispose of it. You read it multiple times. Each reading produces the same combination of discomfort and recognition. The satirists have seen something real. They have identified the absurdity. They have named it Pteridamania, and the name is accurate, and the accuracy is what makes it sting. But naming the madness does not stop it. You know the practice is excessive. You have always known. The knowledge does not change the behavior because the behavior serves functions that rationality does not address. The conservatory is where you exercise expertise. The ferns are what you know about in detail that most people do not know about at all. The collection is your achievement in a life where the achievements available to middle-class Victorian women are limited by social expectations that constrain how competence can be expressed. You will continue collecting ferns. The fashion may be fading, but your practice is not fashion-dependent. It has become too integrated into your daily life and your identity to abandon because satirists mock it or because the cultural moment has passed. The new specimens you acquire will cost less than the specimens you acquired in 1855. The network will shrink as casual collectors leave and serious collectors remain. The practice will become less visible and less culturally prominent. But it will continue because the reasons you do it, the expertise, the identity, the daily structure, the obsessive satisfaction of caring for fragile things, are still present and still powerful. The fern you are whispering to this morning is an adiantum that you acquired last week for £3, which is a price that would have seemed impossibly low in 1855 but which represents current market conditions. The fern is beautiful. It is delicate. It requires the same careful attention that the expensive ferns required. You whisper to it. You check the temperature. You assess the humidity. You examine the fronds for signs of stress. You record the observations in your cultivation journal. You do all of this with the same seriousness that you brought to the 50-pound specimens because the seriousness is about the practice, not about the price. This is madness. This is also meaning. And meaning is not something you are willing to surrender because satirists have named it or because fashion has moved elsewhere. The glass walls of the conservatory reflect morning light. The ferns are green and alive. The temperature is correct and the humidity is maintained, and you have checked both. The specimen you are whispering to shows new growth at the crown, which suggests successful adaptation to your conservatory's conditions. You speak quietly. No one hears. The fern does not respond in any way that you can observe. But you whisper anyway. This is Pteridamania. This is fern madness. This is your life. Maintained through sustained attention to fragile, beautiful things that came from places you will never visit, that cost more than they should, that sometimes die despite perfect care, and that give you something that you cannot fully articulate but that you are not willing to live without. Good night. Thanks for drifting off with us tonight. If this helped you rest, hit subscribe. Drop your city and time in the comments. And wherever you are, whatever you whisper to when no one is listening, I hope it brings you the satisfaction that obsessive care provides regardless of whether the obsessive element is strictly necessary. Good night.